It seems like everywhere you turn these days, there's this underlying anxiety about the economy. I mean, are we headed for a recession? Should I hold off on that big purchase? It feels like a lot of businesses are hesitant to commit to anything big. And even, I see it in my own life too, wondering, what's coming next.
Yeah, it's definitely a time where it feels like we're all kind of walking on eggshells, right?
Exactly. And, the headlines don't exactly paint a reassuring picture. So, for this deep dive, we're really going to try to dig into this whole idea of navigating the economy in a time when the rules of the game, well, frankly, they seem deliberately uncertain.
Absolutely. And we've got some really interesting analysis here that goes beyond just, the typical doom and gloom headlines. And it really tries to look at what are the core drivers of this uncertainty that everyone's feeling. So our goal really is to give you a much clearer picture, like a more nuanced understanding of what's going on and, how businesses and really how all of us are trying to adapt and make decisions in this kind of environment.
I think that's what a lot of people are struggling with right now is just how do you make smart decisions for your business, for your personal finances, when it feels like the ground is constantly shifting beneath your feet?
Right. And the lack of predictability makes planning really, really tough.
Okay, so let's start with what everyone's talking about, recession fears. You see it in the news, in consumer sentiment surveys. The stock market seems to be on this roller coaster ride, and some economic indicators are, well, let's just say they're not exactly inspiring confidence. In fact, our source even points out that President Trump himself has kind of hinted at the possibility of a recession.
Yeah, there have been a number of times where he sort of like alluded to it, not exactly embracing the idea, but not pushing back against those predictions either.
Right. And so you have to wonder, is he signaling something? Does he know something we don't? But here's where the analysis we're looking at gets really interesting, and I think this is a crucial point for our listeners. It argues that, if we look at the fundamental strength of the U.S. economy since President Trump took office, there hasn't been this sudden dramatic collapse of the basic economic factors.
Right. It's not like everything's just fallen apart overnight. The economy is still growing, jobs are being created, people are spending money.
So what's driving this pervasive sense of uncertainty then if the underlying economy isn't in a free fall?
Well, that's where this concept of deliberate uncertainty about policy changes comes in. And I think this is really at the heart of what we're talking about here. And the piece we're looking at actually quotes President Trump directly on this. He says, and I'm quoting here, "I don't want people to know exactly what I'm doing or thinking. I like being unpredictable."
Wow. Okay, so he's basically saying that this uncertainty, at least to some extent, is intentional.
It seems that way.
Hmm.
And you can see how, from a political standpoint, there might be some logic to that, keeping your opponents guessing, maybe trying to gain some sort of leverage in negotiations. But from a business perspective, and really from the perspective of anyone trying to make financial decisions, this kind of unpredictability introduces a whole new level of complexity and risk.
It makes it incredibly hard to plan for the future, right? How do you make long-term investments? How do you set budgets? How do you even just make day-to-day decisions when you don't have a clear sense of what the policy landscape is going to look like in a few months, let alone a few years?
Exactly. And I think one of the biggest examples of this, and it's a major focus of the analysis we're looking at, is the issue of tariffs.
Right. Tariffs are definitely front and center in this whole discussion of uncertainty.
And it's not just the tariffs themselves, it's the uncertainty surrounding them. It's like, when are they going to be implemented? How broad are they going to be? Which countries or industries will be targeted and by how much? And then the really big question is, how long will they last? Are these temporary measures, or are we looking at a more permanent shift in trade policy? And, there's always the risk that this could escalate into like a full-blown trade war, which would have even bigger implications for the global economy.
It's almost like everyone's holding their breath, waiting to see what happens next. And for you, our listener, I think it's really important to understand that tariffs, at their core, are basically a tax on foreign producers.
Right. They're designed to make imported goods more expensive. But the problem is, and this is the part that really hits home for consumers, a good portion of that added cost is likely going to be passed on to you in the form of higher prices.
So it's not just businesses that are feeling the pain of tariffs. It's potentially everyone who buys goods and services, right?
Absolutely. And this uncertainty around the potential scope and scale of these tariffs, it feeds directly into concerns about inflation. We've seen inflation start to come down a bit recently, which is good news. But the worry is that if tariffs are implemented broadly, and especially if they're increased repeatedly, that could really reignite inflationary pressures.
And that brings back the whole issue of purchasing power, how much your money can actually buy. If prices keep going up, it means your paycheck doesn't stretch as far.
Right. Your money buys less. And it's worth noting that this is a different situation than we saw with the tariffs that were implemented back in 2018.
Yeah, that's a good point. Back then, inflation was relatively low, so the impact of those tariffs was mostly felt as like a one-time price increase. But now, in the current environment where inflation has been a major concern, even a single round of tariffs is going to be unwelcome. And if we see multiple rounds of tariff hikes, that could really embed inflationary pressures into the economy for a much longer period.
Exactly. And, it's interesting. You mentioned recession fears earlier, and it's worth remembering that there have been all these predictions of an inevitable recession. We heard it in 2022. We heard it in 2023. We're hearing it again now for 2024.
Right. It seems like every year there's someone predicting a recession just around the corner. And yet, so far at least, those predictions haven't really materialized.
Yeah, they've been like these false alarms. And I think a lot of those predictions were based on the idea that, as inflation rose, it would squeeze consumer spending, people would run out of their pandemic savings, higher interest rates would lead to a wave of bankruptcies, and boom, recession. But the reality is that so far, at least, the economic data hasn't really supported those dire scenarios.
So, if we take a more sober, less sensationalized look at the fundamentals of the U.S. consumer, what does the picture look like? Because ultimately, it's consumer spending that drives a huge chunk of the economy.
Right? Consumer spending is the engine that keeps things running. And I think the analysis we're looking at makes a really important point here. And this is something for our listeners to keep in mind. It suggests that while the risks are definitely increasing, a full-blown recession still seems to be a pretty high bar to clear. And one of the key reasons for that, and this is really important, is the continued strength of the labor market.
So, even with all this uncertainty, businesses are still hiring.
They are, and that's a really positive sign. In a tight labor market where there are more job openings than people to fill them, businesses have to compete for workers, and that means offering higher wages. And now that we're starting to see inflation cool down, those wage increases are actually translating into real gains in purchasing power.
So, people are actually seeing their paychecks go farther now.
That's right. And that has a direct impact on their ability to spend. Consumer spending has grown significantly since 2019, and a lot of that is being fueled by these real wage gains. And it's interesting because businesses seem to have found ways to absorb these higher labor costs, not by just cutting their profits, but by becoming more efficient.
So, they're figuring out how to do more with less.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like they're suddenly cutting corners or anything, but they're finding those incremental improvements in their production processes, their operations, their administrative functions. And, we're even starting to see early stage AI being incorporated into some of these processes, which can help boost efficiency.
That makes sense. So the takeaway here is that while a recession is certainly not impossible, the baseline scenario, at least for now, seems to be continued economic expansion.
I think that's a fair assessment. And that's good news for consumers, it's good news for businesses, it's good news for the overall economy.
Okay, so we've talked about recession fears, we've talked about the deliberate uncertainty coming from the government, and we've talked about the impact of tariffs and the resilience of the consumer. What about other policy tools that could potentially affect the economy, for better or for worse?
Yeah, there are definitely other levers that policymakers can pull. And, one of the most obvious ones is tax cuts. Our source actually touches on this a bit.
Right, tax cuts are always a hot topic, especially during an election year.
It's like the perennial political football.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because the analysis makes a point that I think is really important for listeners to understand. It says that simply extending the 2017 tax cuts, which are set to expire, wouldn't really provide much of an additional boost to the economy
Why not?
because those tax rates are already in effect. So it's not like you're putting more money in people's pockets. You're just maintaining the status quo. But the analysis does mention some other tax proposals that could have a more noticeable impact, especially in terms of offsetting any negative consequences from tariffs.
Such as,
Well, they talk about things like exempting tips from taxes, exempting Social Security income, or exempting overtime pay. These are all things that would directly increase people's disposable income, the money they have left over after paying taxes.
that would definitely put more money in people's pockets, which could help stimulate spending.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, we can't forget about the Federal Reserve, the Fed. They play a huge role in managing the economy.
They're kind of like the central bank of the United States, right? They set interest rates, they control the money supply, all that stuff.
Exactly. And For a long time, there was this kind of implicit understanding in the markets, and really, I think, among a lot of people, that the Fed would always step in and rescue the economy if things started to go south. It was like this safety net that everyone took for granted.
Right, the so-called Fed put.
Yeah, exactly. But the situation's a lot different now, and this is something that really affects the Fed's options. And it has implications for you as a consumer, as a business owner, as anyone who's trying to understand the economy. With inflation still running above their target level, the Fed doesn't really have the same flexibility to just slash interest rates without risking a resurgence of inflation.
So they can't just ride in and save the day like they might have in the past.
Not so easily. They have to be much more cautious, much more measured in their response. So that traditional safety net of a quick and easy Fed rescue might not be as readily available this time around.
So if we're trying to put all of this together, it sounds like while a recession isn't inevitable, the risks have definitely increased, right?
I think that's a fair assessment. The problem is there's so many moving pieces, so many variables, and this deliberate uncertainty around government policy just makes the whole situation incredibly difficult to predict.
It's funny. In the analysis we're looking at, they actually give some potential figures for the impact of tariffs. They say that, a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico combined with a 20% tariff on goods from China could add over a full percentage point to inflation and shave off about 0.8 percentage points from economic growth.
Yeah, but those are just estimates, right? And they're based on a specific set of assumptions.
Right. And as you said, there are so many other factors at play. So it's like those numbers could be magnified, they could be minimized, depending on what actually happens.
Exactly. And I think that's the biggest challenge for businesses and really for anyone trying to understand the economic outlook. This lack of clear signals. It's not like we're dealing with a normal business cycle
Yeah.
where you can look at historical patterns and make reasonably accurate predictions. This is something entirely different, and it requires a different way of thinking.
So, given this environment of deliberate uncertainty, how do you even begin to navigate it? I mean, the traditional economic thinking is that increased uncertainty leads to a slowdown, right? Like businesses postpone investments, consumers put off big purchases, everyone kind of waits to see how things shake out.
Yeah, that's the classic response. But our source makes an interesting argument. They say that with this kind of strategic policy uncertainty, the responses are often a lot more nuanced. It's less about a widespread pause and more about what they call evasive action.
Evasive action, what does that mean?
Well, think about it. Businesses might accelerate their imports to build up inventory before tariffs hit. Consumers might move up their purchases to beat anticipated price increases. Companies might start exploring alternative suppliers, trying to diversify their supply chains and reduce their dependence on a single source. It's about being proactive, about taking steps to manage and mitigate potential disruptions, rather than just passively waiting to see what happens.
So it's like a more strategic approach to uncertainty rather than just hunkering down and hoping for the best.
Exactly. And that leads us to, I think, one of the most important concepts in this whole discussion. Strategic optionality.
Strategic optionality. I like the sound of that. So what exactly does it mean?
Well, at its core, it's about investing in being prepared for multiple potential outcomes. So for a business, this means having contingency plans in place, alternative sources for materials, higher levels of inventory, stronger cash reserves. But it goes deeper than just basic preparedness. It involves really thinking about how you can re-engineer your business model to be more flexible, more adaptable.
So like rethinking your product mix, your marketing strategies, even your entire value chain.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about building the capacity to operate effectively, regardless of what policy changes are implemented. Whether tariffs go up, whether they go down, whether regulations change. You want to be in a position where you can adapt and still thrive.
It's almost like building a kind of organizational agility, right? Being able to pivot and adjust quickly to whatever the environment throws at you.
That's a great way to put it. And the source we're looking at actually suggests that this ability to build optionality, to be adaptable, could become a major competitive advantage in the future.
So it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving in an uncertain world.
Right. It's about turning uncertainty into an opportunity. If you can be the company or the individual who can navigate this turbulent environment effectively while others are struggling to adapt, you're going to come out ahead.
That makes sense. So give us some concrete examples, like how are businesses actually implementing this idea of strategic optionality?
Well, we've seen some interesting examples in industries that are heavily reliant on global supply chains, like, say, tire manufacturing, machinery, furniture. These are all sectors that have been heavily impacted by trade tensions and tariffs.
So what are they doing?
Well, some companies that have, relatively modest production facilities in the U.S. are now actively exploring and scouting for potential locations for new factories here in the U.S.
So they're basically trying to bring production back home.
Or at least create more options, so they're not so dependent on imports. Of course, that's a big undertaking. Building new factories, it takes time, it takes investment, and it could also have an impact on consumer prices. If those goods end up being produced domestically, they might be more expensive.
Right, that's something for consumers to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And there are other options as well. Some companies might decide to just exit certain markets, if they're particularly vulnerable to tariffs or other trade barriers.
Hmm.
Others might pursue mergers or acquisitions, strategic partnerships that allow them to reshape their global operations. And we're even seeing some companies that are fundamentally redesigning their products, making them more modular so they can be assembled from components sourced from different locations or using more localized inputs so they're not so reliant on those long, complex international supply chains.
So it's really about being creative, about thinking outside the box and figuring out how to adapt to this new environment.
It is. And, it's not easy. Not every company has the resources or the flexibility to implement these kinds of changes. But for those that can, it could be the difference between surviving and thriving.
Now, I'm guessing that all of this building of strategic optionality, it probably comes with a cost, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. And that's something the businesses have to weigh very carefully. But the fundamental economic principle is that optionality has value. It's like having an insurance policy. You pay a premium for it, but it gives you peace of mind knowing that you're covered if something unexpected happens. And in an environment defined by deliberate uncertainty, that value of having options, it increases significantly.
So businesses are more willing to pay that premium, to bear those costs because the potential payoff is greater.
That's right. It's like if you know there's a hurricane coming, you're going to be more willing to pay for plywood to board up your windows,
Yeah.
right? You're going to be more willing to invest in those protective measures. And the same principle applies here.
And ultimately, are there broader economic implications to this shift towards prioritizing optionality over maybe pure efficiency?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And our source suggests that, navigating this kind of deliberate uncertainty, it's probably going to lead to a system-wide increase in costs.
Hmm.
As companies focus on building in this flexibility, this redundancy, they might not be operating at peak efficiency. And those added costs could eventually be reflected in the prices that consumers pay.
So it's like a trade-off, right? You gain resilience, you gain adaptability, but you might sacrifice some efficiency in the process.
Exactly. And that could have implications for overall economic growth, for income levels, for the standard of living.
So it's not a costless adjustment.
It's not. But, the analysis also makes a really important point. New challenges often create new opportunities. And that's something that businesses, and really anyone who's trying to navigate this uncertain world, should keep in mind.
So how do we find those opportunities?
Well, for businesses, I think one of the biggest opportunities is to figure out how to build this optionality, this adaptability in a cost-effective way. If you can be the company that can quickly adjust to changing circumstances without breaking the bank, that's going to be a huge competitive advantage.
Makes sense. So what about for individuals, for listeners who are trying to understand how all of this affects their own lives? What are some key takeaways here?
I think there are a few really important points to keep in mind. First, really try to understand the nature of the uncertainty we're dealing with. Don't just assume that more uncertainty automatically equals a bad outcome. Sometimes uncertainty can create opportunities, as we've been discussing.
Right, it's about being prepared, not just being afraid.
Exactly. Second, be careful about just accepting those doom and gloom predictions at face value. There are always going to be people who are predicting the worst, but often those predictions are based on overly simplistic assumptions. So instead of just focusing on the possibility of a negative outcome, really try to understand what specific events or policy changes would actually be required to significantly weaken the economy.
So it's like, ask yourself, what would have to happen for things to really go bad, rather than just assuming that they will?
Right. It's about looking at the underlying strengths of the economy and trying to assess how resilient they are. Third, don't put too much faith in those complex economic models. The economy is a complex system. It's influenced by all sorts of factors, both predictable and unpredictable. So while models can be useful tools, they're not crystal balls. always be aware of their limitations.
So use them to inform your thinking, but don't rely on them blindly.
Exactly. Fourth, don't just passively wait for the uncertainty to pass. This is probably going to be an ongoing period of turbulence, so learn to navigate it. Leading a business and really just managing your own finances, it requires judgment, it requires analysis. It's not just a science, it's an art as well.
So it's about being proactive, about being adaptable.
Exactly. And finally, embrace this concept of optionality. Strategies that might have seemed too expensive or inefficient in the past, they might be worthwhile investments now. It's about having those backup plans, those alternative paths, so you're not caught off guard if things don't go according to plan.
This has been a really insightful conversation. I feel like I have a much better grasp of this whole idea of deliberate uncertainty and how to navigate it. And, as our source points out, this is really something new that we're dealing with. It's not just that the economy is uncertain, it's that the uncertainty is being deliberately generated, often for political purposes. And that makes it even more challenging to predict what's coming next.
And the key takeaway here is that simply pausing, hitting the pause button, waiting for things to settle down, that's not really a viable strategy in this environment. You have to keep moving forward, but you have to do it with an eye toward building optionality, creating that flexibility, that adaptability that will allow you to thrive no matter what happens.
So to bring it all together for our listeners, we've taken this deep dive into navigating the economy amidst deliberate policy uncertainty. We've talked about the fears of a recession, but also the underlying resilience of the U.S. consumer. We've looked at the risks posed by tariffs, the possibility of offsetting policy measures, the evolving role of the Fed, and most importantly, the strategic imperative for businesses, and really for all of us, to build optionality into our operations and our decision-making. While a recession isn't a foregone conclusion, the economic landscape is definitely more complex, it's more uncertain, and it demands a proactive, adaptable mindset.
And with that in mind, here's a final thought for our listeners to consider. Given this understanding of deliberate uncertainty and the importance of strategic optionality, what's one area in your own professional or personal life where you could proactively build more optionality, create more flexibility, more backup plans to help you navigate potential future uncertainty?
That's a great question for everyone to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
Likewise.
And to our listeners, we appreciate you tuning in. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.